People ask me this question more than you might think. Sometimes after a speech, sometimes in an email, or even sometimes in the comments. They look at me and they ask, Bryce, where do you find hope? And, I usually give them an answer. But lately, I've been thinking about whether I've been giving them the whole truth. Because if you'd asked me that same question during the first 5 or 6 years after I was diagnosed with Parkinson's, I would have told you, I don't. I didn't have an inspiring answer. I didn't have some wonderful philosophy. I honestly believe that there wasn't much hope at all. And if that's where you are today, I understand that. I've lived that. But something happened this week that reminded me how much my answer has changed. And I think I finally know where my hope comes from. And I want to share that with you today. Well, welcome to Bryce Unplugged. It's Saturday, just spending some time with you. No list, no 5 mistakes, no 7 warning signs. Today, it's just you and me going to have a conversation. And today's conversation is about hope. And like I said, people always ask me, where do you find your hope? But I don't think that is always the question that they're really asking. Sometimes what I think it really means is, how do you keep going? How do you wake up every morning knowing Parkinson's is still there? How do you talk about this disease week after week without letting it swallow you up? And maybe the hardest question, or the hardest version of that question, is this: how am I supposed to have hope when nothing about this feels hopeful? And I understand that question. Because when I was diagnosed at 40, I did not want to walk out of that appointment feeling inspired. I didn't skip my way into the parking lot thinking, well, this should be an interesting character building exercise. No, I was scared. I was angry. I was confused. And for the first 5 or 6 years, I honestly thought that there was no hope. I wasn't giving up on my family. I wasn't giving up on life. But deep down, I believed the best part of my life was behind me. I thought Parkinson's had already written the rest of my story. And apparently it had written it in a very depressing pen. Back then, I thought hope meant getting my old life back. I thought hope meant waking up one morning and discovering this had all been some bizarre administration error. Sorry, Mr. Perry, we checked the paperwork. You don't have Parkinson's after all. Here is a gift card for the inconvenience. That would have been lovely. But it didn't happen. So I started placing my hope somewhere else, into the next treatment, or the next research announcement, the next breakthrough, the next headline that included the words promising results. And listen, I still believe deeply in research, and I want better treatments. I want a cure. I want every person living with Parkinson's to have more options than we have today. But I learned something the hard way. When all of your hope lives in tomorrow, you stop living today. I kept thinking, when something changes, then I'll feel hopeful. Or when my symptoms improve, I'll start living again. When science catches up, then I'm going to breathe. But Parkinson's did not wait politely while I figured myself out. Life kept happening. My family kept growing. My kids kept growing. There were still birthdays. There were still trips. There were still meals around the table. There were still things to laugh about. And even if sometimes the things that we're laughing about was me trying to put on my jacket and somehow ending up in a wrestling match with my sleeve, that's okay. And slowly my idea of hope began to change. And not because Parkinson's became easier, it didn't, but because life started becoming bigger than Parkinson's. And that brings me to what happened at LSU. This weekend, after my speech, people started coming over to say hello. When a husband and wife came up to me, they looked genuinely excited to meet me, which still feels strange because in my head, it's like, hey, I'm just Bryce. I'm the same person who walks into the room and forgets why he went there. And I remember the wife looked at me and she said, you look younger in person than you do on television, which was really, it was kind. At least I think it was kind. I hope it was kind. But I'm still trying to decide whether that was a compliment or whether I need to have a serious meeting with my camera. Maybe the camera and I are no longer working towards the same goals. I don't know. But anyway, we laughed. And then the husband said something, though, that really stayed with me. He said, I watch every Tuesday, every Thursday, and every Saturday. He knew the schedule. He wasn't somebody who had just clicked on a random video. He and his wife have been spending better part of the week with me. They had made this channel part of their routine, and they didn't come over because they wanted something. They didn't even have a request. They just wanted to say hello. They wanted to say thank you. They wanted me to know the podcast mattered to them. And after I walked away, I stood there and I was thinking, how in the world did Parkinson's lead me here? Because 15 years ago, I thought Parkinson's had taken away my future. I never imagined that somehow through this disease, I'd meet people I never would have met. People from different cities, different countries, different backgrounds. People whose stories somehow feel similar, even though our lives are completely different. I never would have imagined standing at LSU and meeting a couple who would tell me my own upload schedule better than some members of my family probably can. Every Tuesday, every Thursday, every Saturday. That moment gave me hope. And not because it made Parkinson's disappear and not because I suddenly felt wonderfully physically, but because it reminded me that something meaningful has grown out of a part of my life that once felt completely meaningless. Then I came home and I went back to doing what I normally do, reading comments, answering messages, trying to keep track of approximately 47 different projects at the same time. And, I read a comment that stopped me in my tracks, though. And it simply said, you saved my life. We received more than one comment like that over this past year and lots of emails like that. And every single time, though, I stop because those words, they carry weight. I don't just brush past them. I don't treat them like some other nice comment. But I also need to say something really honestly. I don't believe I've saved anyone's life by myself. I don't. I think this community did. Maybe that person found one video on a day that they felt completely alone. Maybe they heard me describing something they'd never been able to put into words, or maybe they went into the comments and saw hundreds of people saying, I understand. That happened to me too. You're not the only one. Maybe someone replied to them. Maybe they joined the club. Maybe they finally felt seen. That's not one person saving somebody. That is a community wrapping itself around somebody and saying, you do not have to carry this by yourself. And that is where I find hope now. Not in pretending Parkinson's is easy, and not in pretending that every day is going to be good. And not in pretending I never get scared, because I do. There are still days when I worry about the future. There are still days when the body does something new and I think, well, that seems very unnecessary. And there are still days when Parkinson's changes the rules halfway through the game and apparently forgets to send me the updated manual. Hope did not remove any of that. It changed what I believed those hard days meant. For the first 6 years, I thought a hard day was evidence that my life was getting smaller. And now I know a hard day is just a hard day. It's not the whole story. It's not the ending. It's one page. Sometimes a really annoying page with terrible pronunciation, but it's still only one page. And somewhere along the way, I realized something. I spent years looking for hope. I looked for it in research. I looked for it in my medication. I looked for it in the possibility that tomorrow might suddenly be easier. And then one day I stopped looking and I started helping. I started talking honestly. I started sharing what Parkinson's actually felt like. I started saying the things I had needed somebody to say to me. And while I was busy trying to help somebody else feel less alone, hope found me. I didn't even notice it happening. There was no dramatic music. There was no beam of light through the clouds. There was no inspirational eagle flying past the window. It happened one person at a time, one comment at a time, one conversation at a time, and one me too at a time. And now when somebody asks, Bryce, where do you find hope? I know the answer. I find it in the husband at LSU who watches every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I find it in his wife telling me I look younger in person, which I plan to mention in every conversation for at least 6 months. And I find it in the person who says a video helped them keep going. I find it in the care partner who had almost no sleep, but still gets up and does it anyway. I find it in the person who walked around the block for the first time in months. I find it in somebody who finally tracked their symptoms and has a better doctor's appointment. I find it in the newly diagnosed person who arrives frightened and is welcomed by people who remember exactly what they feel like, what that fear feels like. And I find it in the person who writes, I thought I was the only one. And 20 people answer, me too. That is hope. Hope is not believing that nothing bad will happen. Hope is knowing that whatever happens, you don't have to face it alone. Hope is not certainty. I used to think it was. I thought hopeful people were somehow sure everything would work out. I'm not sure. I don't know what Parkinson's will look like for me in 5 years. I don't know what treatment will be available. I don't know what challenge is coming next. But I know there is still life here. There is still purpose here. There are still people to meet. There are still stories to be told. And there's still jokes to make, even if Parkinson's occasionally hands us the material without even being asked. And there's still today. And that matters because today is where life actually happens. Not in the future that we're afraid of. Not in the past that we wish we could recover. But today. This ordinary, imperfect, occasionally ridiculous day. That is why we call this doing life today. Not doing life once Parkinson's behaves. Not doing life once we feel completely ready. And not doing life after a cure. Today. With what we have. With the body we woke up in. With the people walking beside us. And with enough hope to take one more step. So if you're watching this and you feel like there's no hope, I'm not going to tell you to cheer up. I'm not going to tell you everything happens for a reason. And I'm definitely not going to tell you just to think positively, because that advice has never once made me want to punch somebody in the mouth. I'm simply going to tell you this. I understand. For 6 years, I thought hope was gone. And I was wrong. It wasn't gone. I just didn't recognize it yet. It didn't look like a cure. It didn't look like getting my old life back. It looked like purpose. It looked like connection. It looked like helping somebody. It looked like a husband and a wife walking across a room at LSU just to say hello. It looked like a comment that said, you saved my life. It looked like all of you. Now, and that brings me to my Bryce-ism. You ready? I spent years looking for hope, and then I stopped looking, and I started helping, and somehow hope found me. Maybe that is how hope works. Maybe we don't always find it by staring off into the distance and waiting for it to come to us. Maybe we build it in small moments. Maybe we pass it back and forth. Maybe some days you have enough hope for somebody else. And on the days that you don't, somebody else carries a little extra for you. So if you're struggling today, borrow some of mine. And I mean that. And when you have a little more than you need, then pass it on. Leave a kind comment. Call somebody. Welcome a new person. Just let them know that you understand. Because you may never know how much that moment matters. You may never know that you became part of the reason somebody else kept showing up. It's important. And if this conversation meant something to you, I don't need a long comment. I just need 2 words. Me too. Because somewhere, somebody is going to read those 2 words and realize that they're not the only person who feels this way. And sometimes that's where hope begins. A lot of times. I love you guys. Thank you so much for spending time with me today. You know what? And I always remember this. I want you to keep showing up. I want you to keep being real. And I want you to keep doing life today. And I'll see you next Tuesday, next Thursday, and again next Saturday. Bye.